Our first presenter will be Katherine Kitterman of the LDS Church History Department. Katherine earned her bachelor's degree in international relations and German studies from Brigham Young University. She also earned a master's degree in public policy from BYU with a concentration in social policy. She currently works in the publications division of the Church History Department, where she researches 20th century LDS history. Katherine has been both a student and a missionary in Austria, and she was privileged to serve for 7 months in the Haag Hausruck branch. And that will be part of her topic today. Katherine.
Hi, I'm hoping this works. Great. All right. The first branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Austria was organized in 1901 at the Huber dairy farm in Rodenbach, a small village 98 kilometers northeast of Salzburg in Upper Austria. 2 years earlier, Johann Huber had learned of the restored gospel from a school friend who had immigrated to the United States, joined the church there, and returned to Europe as a missionary. Recognizing this message as a fulfillment of a dream which had promised him spiritual guidance, Brother Huber traveled 180 kilometers to Munich, Germany, in order to be baptized by an LDS missionary on April 27, 1900. Over the next 4 decades, Brother Huber shared the gospel with family, friends, and acquaintances, and built up an LDS congregation with its locus in nearby Haag am Hausruck. The first Austrian Mormons braved derision, lawsuits, and even violence to practice an unrecognized and misunderstood religion in a conservative rural society. Their experiences highlight broader themes in the worldwide expansion of the church. Similar to early converts in many countries and at many times, Latter-day Saints in Austria navigated tense relationships with their local civic, religious, and educational leaders. They attempted to balance seemingly contradictory identities, both as members of the rural Catholic farming communities where they lived and worked, and also as members of the foreign religious congregation they had joined through covenant. They also dealt with conflicts within that covenant congregation. Still, despite limited contact with church leadership and missionaries, many of these saints maintained their faith in the restored gospel in the face of both external and internal pressures. The legal and social difficulties facing Austria's first Mormons in the early 20th century had prevented their new faith from gaining a foothold for decades. Roman Catholicism was firmly rooted in the culture and government of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and local religious leaders and civil authorities fought against Mormon incursions. In rural regions such as Upper Austria, a conservative and poorly educated population was generally disinclined to entertain messengers of a foreign faith or to challenge the existing authority structures. Active opposition and natural apathy presented almost overwhelming barriers to LDS missionaries attempting to spread a new faith. Despite these difficulties, Mormon missionaries had initially attempted to establish an Austrian presence almost 40 years before Johann Huber's conversion. The first missionary sent to the Austrian Empire was the Apostle Orson Pratt, who arrived in Vienna in April 1865, along with Swiss Italian mission president William W. Ryder. They weren't the first Latter-day Saints to enter the Habsburg lands, but they were the first who planned to stay. Pratt had been preparing for over a year to open an Austrian mission by studying to preach in German and reading up on Austrian history and politics. His enthusiasm, however, was met by a complete lack of success in obtaining legal status for the church or in interesting people in his message. Pratt complained that the Habsburg monarchy had effectually shut out all religious liberty from the empire by imprisoning those who met together to read the Bible and banishing foreigners who attempted to preach repentance. Ryder blamed conservative religious traditions for the missionaries' lack of success, writing to a friend in Utah that the universal power and dominion of the Catholic Church has bound her children's hands and feet to such a degree that they can't move a finger, and almost all exhibit a natural apathy toward our religion. The two left Austria after a few months, having gained no converts. Over the next few decades, missionaries attempted to preach in Austria only sporadically. In addition to the inherent difficulty of proselytizing for a foreign faith in a conservative Catholic nation, Mormons entering the Austrian Empire also faced active opposition from the United States government in the late 19th century. In 1879, U.S. Secretary of State William Evarts had instructed American diplomatic officers to enlist the help of European governments in hindering Mormon agents' recruitment activities. They claimed that it was a criminal enterprise to recruit converts to immigrate to Utah and practice polygamy. The American ambassador to Austria reported in February 1880 that Austrian law already prohibited Mormon proselytizing, and officials had been instructed to report any appearance of Mormons in their provinces. In the first such report, the governor of Carinthia had notified Vienna of a missionary who took lodgings in an inn, but after his efforts proved fruitless, immediately disappeared. When Thomas Biesinger and Paul Hammer were sent to open an Austrian mission just 3 years later, they were carefully watched and were also denied legal permission to preach. They split up in order to draw less attention to themselves, but Brother Biesinger was eventually arrested in Prague, tried, and sentenced to imprisonment and a fine. The missionaries' efforts did bear some fruit, however. Biesinger was able to share the gospel with a man whose accusations had imprisoned him, and Hammer baptized the first Mormon convert in the Habsburg monarchy. This was 29-year-old Paul Haslinger, in the village of Lambach. Still, the missionaries had to return to Germany without establishing a permanent Austrian presence. As the sole Mormon in Austria, it appears that Paul Haslinger had little contact with other Mormons until the spring of 1900. It was then that a newspaper notice informed him that a convert to Mormonism named Johann Huber. He was a prominent dairy farmer from the village of Rottenbach, 25 kilometers away. The news of his baptism caused quite a sensation among the conservative rural farming communities of Upper Austria, but Huber had already made a name for himself as a free thinker when he had left the Catholic Church a year earlier. This picture shows the Huber family in 1910. Huber began to study the Bible more intensively and searched for a church that matched its teachings. He resisted the attempts of relatives and local religious leaders to win him back to Catholicism and sought for divine direction, later recalling that he had the wish to find the Church of Jesus Christ, if it was at all here on the earth. So I asked my Father in heaven to make this church known to me. Comfort came in the form of a dream in which he was told that he would find the truth. The person who fulfilled that dream was Martin Gangelmeier, a school friend of Huber's who had immigrated to America and joined the LDS Church. While visiting home during a mission to Germany, Gangelmeier talked with Huber about the restoration of Christ's church, and he left him several tracts. The two men corresponded when Gangelmeier returned to his missionary efforts, and Huber, who was already enthusiastic about his friend's message, was deeply touched by his invitation to pray for a personal witness of its truth. He received that testimony and made the journey to Munich a few months later to be baptized by the nearest Mormon missionary. Huber's enthusiasm for the gospel drove him to share it with his family and friends despite local authorities' prohibitions. From the time of his baptism, he held meetings in his barn and frequently visited acquaintances to discuss the Bible, often bringing one of his children along. As Huber reached out, his brother, a farm worker, and others were baptized, and a branch was organized in 1901. More baptisms followed in 1903, 1904, 1906, and so on. Many of these converts followed Huber's proselytizing patterns in their own communities, inviting friends and coworkers to meetings in their homes. Friends who desired to join the church were baptized by missionaries, often visiting from Munich. Johann Huber and those who followed him into the waters of baptism navigated the same local, social, and legal obstacles that had stymied Mormon missionaries for over a decade. When Huber joined what one court called a fanatical sect, his already problematic relationships with local authorities were strained even further. These leaders exerted their social influence to convince others that Mormonism posed a threat to their community. Huber's youngest daughter, Maria, recalled that they wanted to set fire to our house. They wanted to stone us. And such things he said in his sermons, the minister, they told us that it was from him. Misunderstanding and misinformation fueled this opposition. The priest of one nearby village gave a garbled account of Mormon history and doctrine in a weekly newspaper, and this was quoted in a legal judgment against Johann Huber in 1903. The excerpt you see reads, "They claim the 1,000-year reign of Christ in which all will belong to the Latter-day Saints. This doctrine is a sickened outgrowth of Protestant sectarianism, closely related to Mohammedanism." This unflattering picture and untrue picture of Mormon beliefs and association with other feared foreign faiths could only hurt Mormon converts in their neighbored eyes. Franz Rosner, Huber's son-in-law and later a convert himself, felt uneasy in social situations with Catholics. He was told by his friends that his gravel works would do more business if he weren't a Mormon. Maria Huber remembered that when her father married a Mormon woman from Germany after his first wife died, the neighbors attempted to turn her stepchildren against her by spreading gossip. Religious and civic authorities in Rottenbach and Haag used existing legal frameworks in efforts to restrict Mormons' religious practices and prevent more converts from joining with them. Huber was forbidden to promote reading the Bible, and in an attempt to end the study classes he had organized in Rottenbach and in Haag am Hausruck, he faced lawsuits aimed at taking away his children and trying to get him admitted to an institution for the mentally ill. Children were legally required to belong to a recognized religion, and were later also prohibited from participating in Mormon worship services. When Huber refused to allow his children to attend Catholic religious instruction, the district school council levied a fine, which was upheld against his appeal because he lacked legal grounds of excuse. Even 20 years later, in the early 1920s, Sister Anna Kreuss was summoned to the local school shortly after her baptism and threatened with a fine if she did not re-enroll her children in Catholic instruction. Her daughter Leopoldine later claimed to have been the top student in that class. Because they were misunderstood and often feared, Mormons living in several communities faced opposition from their neighbors when they opened their homes for Bible study, cottage meetings, or worship services. Leopold and Anna Zillner were baptized in 1906 and 1907, and they hosted classes and cottage meetings in their apartment in Wels. When they refused to return to the Catholic Church, they found themselves evicted one day without notice, their furniture packed into a shed as they stood on the street with their 4 children. Unable to find other housing from landlords who refused to rent to Mormons, they spent the first night in the jail. The city government then allowed them to rent a 16 square meter apartment, where the 6 of them slept in 2 beds for years. The war widow Maria Meyer was also evicted from her home in Pram in 1923. This was a few months after her baptism. After unsuccessfully challenging this action, she could only find accommodation in her hometown of Frankenburg, which was 25 kilometers away from the nearest members in Haag. Members suspected that the eviction might have been an attempt to prevent her children from being baptized by keeping them out of reach, but that intention was thwarted. Johann, Maria, Anna, and Theresia Meyer were baptized by a missionary and confirmed by the visiting district president just a few weeks after their forced move. Franz and Leopoldine Rosner raised the ire of some families living in other apartments of their large and multi-family house by hosting the branch's Sunday worship services. The Rosners were thrown out of their own home on several occasions, and their opponents grew bolder when they continued to use their apartment as a gathering place. One neighbor came in during a meeting with a knife and threatened the participants, but he ended up severing the tendon of his own fingers when he accidentally stabbed his hand while trying to make a point. This picture shows the street on which the Rosners lived. Their home would have been to the left. On another occasion, a man broke down the Rosners' door and ripped the clothing out of their closets. When Franz Rosner escaped through a window and attempted to fetch the police, he was disappointed to hear that the officer said he wouldn't arrest the man. He was determined to defend himself, and so Brother Rosner obtained a firearms license, bought a revolver, and announced that he would shoot the next person who attempted to disrupt their meetings. Although opposition had diminished somewhat since Huber's first years as a Mormon, it heightened when missionaries were assigned to live and serve in Haag am Hausruck in 1921. I suppose a missionary. The first missionary who was based full-time there was the German Karl Weiss, who arrived that fall, baptized 2 converts the next February, and planned a service on the 1st of April for 5 more in the Meadow Pond. That morning, the daughter of one of these prospective members overheard a few men in Haag planning to disturb the service, so she ran home to tell her parents and Brother Weiss. Her sister remembered seeing him kneel in prayer before deciding to conduct the baptisms an hour earlier than they had previously planned. The would-be disturbers arrived on the hillside above the pond only after the 5 members had come out of the water, just as the gathered saints were singing the closing song. They were unable to do more than shoot into the water below. The threats didn't stop there, however. One Sunday morning, a group of drunk men stood outside the branch's meeting place with large sticks, waiting to attack Brother Weiss when he emerged at the end of the meeting. One sister confronted the men as she left the building, and she was struck down. The sight of her bleeding on the street softened the hearts of the attackers, among which was her own son, and they left without further action. Although opponents sometimes employed threats and violence to intimidate local Mormons, the rare occurrences were usually directed at foreign missionaries who attempted to go from door to door. Members of the Haag branch also faced challenges in their relationships with each other. On several occasions, hurt feelings fueled conflicts among members that threatened to tear the branch apart. When information about some of the members' tithes and fast offerings was somehow given to others, a few families were offended, and they stayed away from special meetings held to commemorate the centennial of the church. This was a big blow to an already small group. Gossip was also a problem, and at one point things got so bad that some members started preaching from the Bible that women should keep silent in church. On these and other occasions, the disputes were eventually resolved through long settlement meetings, but not before they dampened the spirit of the branch and crippled missionary efforts. Members' physical isolation from other believers and church leaders also exacerbated the damage done by internal conflict. Limited means of communication and transportation made regular contact with the furthest members quite difficult, and travel to conferences in Vienna, the seat of the district for a while after 1909, was prohibitively expensive. Contact with nearer branches in Germany and Switzerland was almost non-existent, and it was rare rather than often that a missionary was living and working in the branch. Despite these external and internal pressures, most members of the Haag branch reached out to an antagonistic community and did their best to work with each other. Throughout the interwar period, there were consistently 2 or 3 friends at each meeting, which rounded out to about 25 to 30 members, so about 10% attendance of non-members. Special primary and Sunday school activities drew crowds twice the size. They adjusted meeting schedules and places to avoid disruptions, and Franz Rosner eventually built a house in which the branch could meet undisturbed. Members adapted church programs to their own circumstances, for example, instituting a ward teaching program in 1930 despite a small number of priesthood leaders who could go and long distances that they had to travel. District presidents also made admirable efforts to visit the branch as often as possible. Some characteristics that united the members of the Haag branch at this time were their faith in the restored gospel, of course, but also their firm conviction, almost a giant conviction, as one member said. People who joined a religious minority, something that was seen as an American sect, had to be strong and independent of mind. One missionary reported in a meeting that the 12 adult saints present all bore strong, touching testimonies of the truth and authenticity of Mormonism, a proof in every case of the value of the gospel to these dear saints and to every honest member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Austrian Mormons at the turn of the 20th century faced similar situations to many converts in Europe in their tense relationships with local authorities who were backed by public opinion. What was unique for the saints here was that they navigated these difficulties without the religious and social support of missionaries, who were often forced to leave as soon as they baptized their converts. The history of the Haag am Hausruck branch provides a glimpse into the struggles and joys of life as part of a minority religious community in early 20th century Europe. Their experiences are bright threads in the global tapestry of Latter-day Saints' struggles to overcome challenges and disappointments through covenants and faith in the atonement of Jesus Christ. Thank you.